This last section is on diseases. So, we've been talking about toxins, and we know that some diseases are caused by the ingestion of these toxins. This becomes more of an intoxication rather than an infection. So, for example, botulism hits within only a couple of hours. This really isn't enough time for that bacteria to really be growing and increasing in population. It really has more to do with that bacteria releasing the toxins and causing problems. We also know that toxins can act on the nervous system. So things like botulism with Botox, tetanus toxins as well, enterotoxins. These are going to be things that act on the digestive tract. We also know that viruses cause disease. We talked a lot about viruses in chapter 11. In order for a virus to cause disease, it has to attach. Remember that attachment is called adsorption. And then it has to get inside in order to take over that host cell machinery to multiply. So, if we were to look at cells that were infected with a virus, they would actually look different underneath the microscope. We call this cytopathic effect. So, as that virus is taking over the host cell machinery, we could maybe see some inclusion bodies. We might be able to see some different dense areas where there's that viral nucleic acid. So viruses can actually do some changes to cells so that they look different. They look wonky. So you could actually see this looking underneath the microscope at a viral infected cell. Now, there's different types of viral infections. A productive infection, this is really successful from the point of view of the virus. So that virus is going to be able to absorb, it's going to be able to get in, take over the host cell machinery, and divide. It's going to be able to multiply. That's a productive viral infection. It's successful from the point of view of the virus that is able to replicate. An abortive viral infection, this is when the virus can absorb, it can inject its DNA, can get in, but it doesn't really have the proper machinery in order to continue with that replication. So those proteins and enzymes just aren't going to be compatible. This is kind of like if you've never flown a plane and you get into the cockpit of a plane and you're looking at all of those buttons and dials and saying, what do I do here? I got into the plane, but now I can't fly it because I have no idea what I'm doing. So those proteins and enzymes just aren't going to be compatible. So even though that virus was able to invade, it's not going to be able to replicate. So this would be an abortive viral infection. Now, as far as the host goes, this is going to be good because that virus is not going to be able to replicate. A latent viral infection, this is where there's some activity during the initial infection, but then it kind of hides out and then it could possibly come out later on. We usually think about latent viral infections as being associated with the lysogenic cycle. Remember, they're going to kind of creep in and hide out. So, we talked about some of those latent viruses like the herpes virus that can actually hide out in the nervous system and then it can actually reactivate later on. So, for example, if the host is immunocompromised, then and that virus can later reactivate and come back out. A persistent viral infection, this is something that can last for years and years. So, something like hepatitis B virus, where that virus just continues to invade and multiplies continuously. We also know eukaryotes can cause disease as well. We talked a lot about this in the parasitology chapter. So we know that fungi, they can cause disease. So they can produce reproductive spores. They can be inhaled or ingested. They can also produce enzymes that attack the host cells. They can also release toxins that can cause allergic reactions. Remember, an allergic reaction, this is when the immune system is kind of going above and beyond. So, an example of this is that if, let's say, manufacturer is making some peanut butter with some peanuts that were moldy and actually had this fungi, and the fungi was producing these aflatoxins, and when people consumed it, they were having a reaction to that toxin. Now, they weren't exactly allergic to the peanuts, but they were having a reaction because of that toxin. You might think this is kind of rare. I did have a student several years ago. She said this was exactly what happened to me. She said, for years I thought I was allergic to peanuts. Turns out it was just caused by these aflatoxins. So it was this fungus that was actually producing these toxins that were having an effect on her. We also talked about protozoans, so Plasmodium, which reproduces in red blood cells, Giardia, which causes giardiasis, that affects intestinal tissues. And then we also talked about those helminths, those worms. They can release toxic wastes and antigens that can cause some issues like allergies in hosts. So, we're going to get into a little more with diseases and talk about signs, symptoms, and syndromes, and then kind of go through the progression of a disease. So, a sign is going to be something that can be observed um, on the patient. So, this is going to be characteristic of a disease that you as a clinician can actually observe. So, you would be able to observe if there was swelling or redness. You would be able to take their temperature to find out if they had a fever, if they were vomiting, if they were coughing, if they were producing a lot of white blood cells. You could actually take some blood work to find that out. So, signs are things that you as a clinician can actually observe or measure. A symptom is going to be a characteristic of a disease that only can be felt by a patient. So, this is what your patient is telling you. So, if you ask them if they are in pain, they can tell you how bad the pain is, if they're having shortness of breath, if they're feeling nauseous, if their head hurts, if they've got a sore throat, if they're just kind of feeling blah. That's like the general malaise. So, a symptom is going to be something that your patient can tell you. Now, when you put all of these signs and symptoms together, the combination is going to be that syndrome. So, certain diseases are going to have certain hallmark signs and symptoms that it's going to make it a little easier for you as a clinician to diagnose. Now, sometimes things don't present typically, and so it might be a little harder to diagnose. But putting all of those signs and symptoms together can kind of allow you to look at some of the different syndromes that might be causing it. So here we are again with our definitions. Many of these definitions you're going to be familiar with. So things like acute develops rapidly, chronic is going to be over a long period of time. We just talked about latency. So periods of inactivity, periods of activity. If something is local, it's going to be confined to a specific area of the body. So, for example, my cellulitis was local. The worry, though, is that it could actually become systemic and lead to an effect all over the body. We've talked a lot about primary and secondary infections. So, a primary infection, this would be the first initial infection, and then that could actually lead to a secondary infection. So, for example, if you got the flu, that would be your primary infection. And then if you ended up getting a bacterial bronchitis, that would be the secondary infection. Super infections can happen when the host is compromised. So, especially if people are taking antibiotics and it's basically clearing away that good bacteria, now there's going to be space for that pathogenic bacteria to move in. And I was talking about how sometimes diseases won't present in the classic sense. And this is when they might be subclinical. So they're not producing all of those classic signs and symptoms. And so it might be a little harder to diagnose. So, lastly, we're going to talk about the stages of infection. And this is something we've all experienced because we've all been ill at one time or another in our life. So, I'm going to use the example of the chicken pox that I got as an adult. So, when I moved to Massachusetts, of course, you know that moving can be a very stressful time. I ended up with the chicken pox. I often call it my welcoming present to Massachusetts. It wasn't so welcoming though. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about how I was feeling during each of these different stages. So, the first stage is the incubation period. This is going to be the time between the infection and the appearance of those signs and symptoms. Now, this can vary for diseases. So, I'm going to show you a little chart here. Here's a chart of some typical incubation periods for diseases. So if we take a look at things like influenza, that's going to be a very short time, like maybe 24 to 48 hours. Something like a cold is typically 48 hours. Chickenpox is more on the average of about 2 weeks. So once I figured out what was going on, I was trying to count back, like where was I? Who was I around 2 weeks ago? I never really did find out where I picked it up. Something like leprosy could be years. Something like rabies could actually be quite a long time as well. So typically, viruses are anywhere from 5 to 10 days. I will tell you, when my kids were younger, I could pretty much count when each of us was going to be getting that viral disease. So one kid would get it 5 days later, another one, and then another few days, my husband would get it. Just when I was like at that 10 days, and I thought, oh, I finally cleared this. That's of course when I would get it. So typically, viruses that we see are anywhere from 5 to 10 days. The chickenpox that I had was about 2 weeks. So the next stage is the prodromal period. So this is when we have the onset of signs and symptoms. Now, usually they're vague at this point. So we're just not feeling the best. We know that something is wrong, but we're not sure. This is also the time that we're going, I'm not sick, I'm not sick. And what are we doing? We're going out and we're infecting everybody, right? We're exposing everybody. So the prodromal period for my chickenpox seemed to last for a few days. I just felt blah. I felt kind of feverish, and I just thought, gee, if I could just get over whatever this is or just bring it on. Little did I know what was ahead of me. But I just did not feel right. Something else also happens during this period. I always end up with weird cravings. I tend to crave these weird things that I haven't had in years when I'm getting sick. When my kids were little, they used to have a ravenous appetite. So I knew that we were either in for something or they were going through a growth spurt if they were eating everything in sight. So, depending on the disease, that prodromal period can last varying amounts of time, and you can have some different symptoms, although not really descript. Then it's the invasive phase. This is when we're seeing the typical signs and symptoms. Now, the height of our symptoms when we're feeling the worst and when we've got those classic signs and symptoms, that's acme. Sometimes it can be fulminating, where it can be sudden and severe. And I will tell you, my pox was fulminating. It was like my neck and head exploded into a giant pox. It's not the best feeling when medical professionals will wince at you. When I went to see the one doctor that finally diagnosed me, he said, well, it's not the worst case I've ever seen. That wasn't such a great feeling. And it was also one of those that people that saw me, they're like, oh, it's not so bad. But then when it was over, they're like, oh my gosh, that was really bad. It's also during this time that we can get a fever. And in the immune chapters, we're going to be talking about fever. Fever is basically when our hypothalamus resets at a higher temperature to kind of get rid of those pathogens. And fever is caused by pyrogens. So these pyrogens that are acting on our internal thermostat, the hypothalamus. Then we finally start to feel a little better. And this is the decline phase. So symptoms start to subside. We're finally getting some rest. And now our immune system is better able to do its job. And then we've got the convalescence period. Now, this is when we've got healing, tissues are being repaired. This can also last a wide range of time as well. As we know, long COVID, we know that people have had issues from COVID for a long period of time. I can tell you that I've had some cases of viral laryngitis that have lasted a long time. Not such the best thing when you have to talk all the time. There was one summer that in micro I ended up getting laryngitis, and I couldn't talk for a couple of days. I had to do lab because we were actually doing two labs, and I kind of had to whisper all of the instructions. Let me tell you that that was the quietest lab I ever had. Why is it that when you whisper, everybody else feels like they need to whisper? And so people were asking, "Do I put this in here?" And I was like, "Yes, you guys don't need to whisper." But I will tell you, I got that in June. It wasn't until probably late October I finally got my full range of voice back. So that can take a while as well. So if we take a look at sort of the bell curve of what's happening here. So first we've got the incubation period. So this is um, when we've been exposed to when we start to see those signs and symptoms. Again, it can vary for different diseases. For my chickenpox, it was about 2 weeks. For the flu, it could be 24 hours. Then we've got the prodromal phase. Again, this can vary depending on the disease. For my chickenpox, it was a few days. I know when I've had COVID, it's been a couple of days. Then we've got the invasive phase. So this is when we're seeing those classic signs and symptoms, and we're going through that progression of disease. And then finally, we're getting on the other side of it on decline phase. We're starting to recover. Immune system is able to do its job. And then that convalescence period where we're healing, depending on the disease, it can take quite a while. And I can tell you from my chickenpox, it actually took a few weeks to fully recover. So think about the times not so pleasant to think about when we were sick, but you could probably pinpoint when you were actually in each of these stages.